So I'm pushing the feed. You'll see just now, you'll see what's going to affect. It's going to say to you, the screen is touching shortly. So you watch the screen, you'll see.
Hello?
Yeah. watching. This is our second Legal-Wise Red Round Table conversation, and it's a great pleasure to have everyone here today. Gender-based violence is a profound human rights violation. It leads to psychological trauma, and it can also lead to behavioral and physical consequences for the survivors. South Africa has one of the highest femicide rates in the world. 3 women die at the hands of their intimate partner every day. This shows that we have quite a dire situation on our hands that needs very much everyone around the table and everyone in society to do something about it. Oftentimes, children are forgotten in the conversation with regard to gender-based violence, and there's a very big link between domestic violence and child abuse. And that is why we are having this conversation today, to make sure that we also make sure that children are included in the conversation on gender-based violence, and also with regard to mandatory reporting of child abuse. During the 16 Days of Activism campaign, government, civil society, as well as the private sector are encouraged to have dialogues, as well as to do something about it, not just to talk about it, but to be about it. So this is quite a fitting conversation to have with these lovely ladies that I have with me today. And the aim of it is to basically gain an understanding of the legal requirements for mandatory reporting of child abuse in South Africa, gain insight on how to recognize the signs that a child could exhibit who is a victim of abuse, as well as identifying where child abuse can happen, whether it's in the home, broader society, school, and places where children are. So I'll just like to take this moment to have our esteemed panel introduce themselves to everyone. Thank you.
Oh, I guess that's me first. I'm Professor Corné Davis from the Department of Strategic Communication, University of Johannesburg, and I'm here representing Matla Abana today.
Hi everyone, I'm Bongiwe Kumete from the South African Human Rights Commission, Gauteng Provincial Office. I am the Advocacy and Research Officer. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Kavya Swaminathan. I'm representing the Tears Foundation. We're an NPO that assists victims of gender-based violence and sexual abuse.
And I am Lita Letemba Stwai. I am the Manager of Impact Litigation here at Legal-Wise. Thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. So in the next few moments, I just want to give a broader understanding on the topic of mandatory reporting. So Section 110 of the Children's Act basically says that a number of professionals, 23 that are on that list, including teachers, doctors, traditional healers, religious leaders, psychologists, who suspect that a child has been abused, need to actually report that to the Department of Social Development, social workers, or child protective organizations, or SAPs. And the reason for this is because those are the people that can actually do something about it. Social workers are the ones who can remove a child from the home if the child is in imminent danger, and SAPs are the ones who actually have to do the investigation when it comes to the perpetrators, making sure that the investigations happen and people are held accountable. So, let me start with you, Prof. How have you've done a lot of research on gender-based violence. Can you tell us, with regard to the report you've just done, what the findings were?
This was interesting. We had 2 streams of research. The first stream focused on what did CEOs and leaders in the private sector know about the prevalence of gender-based violence in South Africa and its consequences. The second stream was a survey among employees to determine what did they know about gender-based violence, what did they think we should be doing in South Africa, and what were the drivers of gender-based violence. And I'll focus on the findings of the employees first. Generally, there was an awareness of the kind of violence committed against children, since we're talking about children in particular. So there was an awareness that children are being physically, emotionally, verbally, and sexually abused. So that's concerning that there's such an awareness, but we see less action. The second thing that was really important is that people asked across the board to be educated, to be informed, to understand the different kinds of gender-based violence. What constitutes gender-based violence? People don't understand that even emotional and verbal abuse is gender-based violence, and we've become a society where we are so capable of that ourselves, because it's been normalized. We grew up with it, and then we exhibit the same behavior. Because remember, violence starts verbally, and then it can escalate. So, and children get exposed to this all the time. And what you said was correct. South Africa's statistics with violence against women and children 5 times higher than the global average. So the chances that if you're a South African, you either are a victim or perpetrator, or you're related to a victim or perpetrator, or you're acquainted with a victim or perpetrator. That is the reality.
Thank you. Kavi, I think this question could go to you. So if a child comes to me and they tell me that they've been a victim of abuse or sexual abuse, what can I do and how should I respond to that child?
I think the first thing to remember is that children are very intuitive when it comes to your reaction. So being calm and really listening to them and probing in such a way that you remain on the child's level. Because when the child comes to you, there's a high chance that they don't have the terminology to really express what's happened to them. So they'll use words like tickled or played, and he does this or they do this. So I think being on their level and gently probing, because if you show your distress, the child will immediately close themselves off, because they will see what has happened to them as their fault, they will see it as shameful, and once a child closes down, getting them to open up again is very difficult, because a lot of the times, by the time a child comes to disclose to an adult, a lot of stuff has happened. It's not just an incident, there's a pattern of behavior that's distressing the child at this point.
Prof, I think we're speaking of children, and it's so important. A lot of things happen when you're young, you're a child, but what happens when you find out that I'm now an adult, but what happened to me, the sexual abuse occurred when I was a child? So what happens in such cases?
Well, it's going to depend on what the person wants to do, because as we know, most victims don't want it reported. There are too many consequences and the stress from family members who will say, but how can you disgrace the family by now bringing up something that happened so long ago? Get over it. We have got the limitation of 20 years, I believe, in South Africa at the moment. So a person is free to go and lay charges. Your challenge is, of course, that there may be a lack of evidence. Because it's happened so long ago, there's no forensic evidence. So it's going to be the victim's word against the perpetrator. So there's a lot of secondary trauma involved already in that process. But sometimes people require closure, and they have to have the opportunity to follow that route if that is going to bring them closure. Because sometimes what happens, when a victim comes forward after such a long time, you'll find that other people might also come forward and say, oh, he's done that to me too, or this has happened to me too, which can strengthen the case. Look at when we saw on media the hashtag Me Too campaign, or Not In My Name campaign, where people started coming forward, and then you see others come forward. So that is always an option for children to actually, as adults, go back there if they wish.
And I'm glad you touched on that even if there's time that has passed with regard to the crime occurring, when you speak up about it, other people also get the opportunity to speak up, and that actually does strengthen the case. So, Ms. Gumede, you are coming from the Human Rights Commission, and I know it's one of our protectors of our human rights as South Africans. So how do you often get people coming to the Human Rights Commission with such cases, and how do you assist them, or what do you tell them?
So as a commission, we are a Chapter 9 institution, and our mandate is basically to promote, protect, as well as to monitor human rights and the violation of human rights. So what often happens is that in cases where we have an individual coming into the office or the commission, we have referral systems that the commission then utilizes to ensure that the individual gets the right kind of help. So as Prophet mentioned, that a lot of the cases of abuse leave you traumatized and you needing psychosocial services that you should then get from social workers. So as a commission, our role specifically is to play then an oversight role, where we ensure that the people know firstly where they need to go when such a thing happens. That's where I go back then to our referral system. And then once they have gone there, our monitoring leg kicks in to ensure that once a person has gone there, has the institution that is mandated to assist them been able to assist. So I think one of the main things then becomes the advocacy, or knowing, people need to know that this is what constitutes a human rights violation, this is what constitutes sexual abuse, especially with children. So once they are able to know, we can then refer them to the relevant bodies and then monitor or track whether those bodies have been able to assist in the way they are mandated to do.
Kavya, you touched on how to engage with children when they're reporting. From Tears Foundation, how do you engage? So if I call Tears Foundation, or if a child engages Tears Foundation, how do you help the person who is the victim or the survivor of abuse in that whole process?
So when it comes to children, we always try to focus on a dual reporting system, right? So you have to report to SAPs, like you said, and we also report to social workers, because social workers actually have so much power, and sometimes I don't even think they know how much power they have to actually intervene in a case like this. So there's actually something called a Form 22 that is a very comprehensive form that we can fill out. So our main aim is to try to get as much information from the reporter, or if in some cases the child is calling themselves. And that's oftentimes a struggle because people don't want to get involved. And unless you have certain details, it's very difficult for an investigation to take place. So sometimes it can feel very probing to ask questions like, what kind of abuse are you talking about? Or what have you noticed? Or you might have to give a statement. And where does the child live? What school do they go to? Because sometimes the person reporting doesn't have all that information. And sometimes if it's the child reporting, they're scared. They don't want to give you that information. They want an outlet to express themselves, but they don't actually want anyone involved because they're so scared of having people come and investigate and probe into their lives. So it's very difficult, but I think DSD, so social workers, and SAPS reporting is the most vital step when it comes to kids.
And through your studies and your the information that you've gathered through the years, and the whole thing of mandatory reporting, what happens when people do not report?
Well, I don't think people are aware enough of the law. As you know, people don't read enough because there's many reasons. Information overload, or they're too busy, or there's many reasons. Ignorance is unfortunately often a choice. People act as if they don't know. And therefore they're not going to say, well, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know, what I'm supposed to do. But if you look at the Act, it's all people engaged with children, including teachers, including medical doctors, social workers, psychologists at the school, caregivers. Any person engaging with a child is obligated to report if they suspect that some kind of abuse is taking place. And the consequence for not doing so can be imprisonment or fining. Our challenge in South Africa is that the legislation is not being applied. There is no checking system. Nobody is seeing. I mean, we saw the case with the 934 little girls aged 10 and 11, besides all the others 12 to 19, 18, who gave birth to babies during COVID. There were parents, there were teachers, there were medical practitioners who saw little girls that age pregnant and delivering babies, and to date I've not seen any prosecution happening. So yes, there are consequences, but are they enforced is what we need to ask.
That is quite something, and I think it's an important point that you've raised, that age of consent, no child can consent under the age of 12. And what you're even mentioning is that that happened during the pandemic when everyone was on deep lockdown. So it points to the fact that the abuse actually happened within the home or within the immediate environment where the child was at, because no school was happening. And what does happen in those cases? And that's when the social workers are supposed to come in to make sure that they investigate if the child needs to be removed from the home, placed in temporary safe care. That's what's supposed to happen while you investigate. So in the cases, Bongiwe, where you've gone to your DSD, you've gone to SAPS, and nothing happens, what can a person do?
In those situations where already they have tried all the other places, that's when the commission, rather the protection mandate of the commission comes in. Because as I indicated earlier on, the Commission is there to protect the rights and the observance of human rights. So when that happens, it's when the Commission then needs to go to those particular departments in order to get information from them on what is it that is currently happening in this particular case. So our role then becomes us monitoring, right? So often I look at it as you monitor things in order for you to know what to protect, and once you've protected it, you need to monitor whether the thing is still being protected. So as the Commission, in order to apply that necessary pressure to the government institutions, because if we take a little bit of a step back, government institutions, when we're talking about police, they have a responsibility. They are mandated to be the ones who are doing the investigations. So if someone has come through and has reported, but nothing has happened, and they say, we've tried to go to the Department of Social Development, again, nothing has happened, then the Commission needs to come in to find out why is nothing happening. Those people need to then be called to task to account for why has there been no action, and then have also deadlines, because as we know in South Africa, oftentimes you get recommendations or actions are said that they are going to happen with no definite timelines. You need a timeline so that you can go back 2 months from now and say, what has happened to this case? The heads of departments then need to come in and account to the Commission. We have that power as a Commission to call state institutions into providing us information as to why this particular right has not been respected. And oftentimes this is not happening enough, unfortunately.
So this is a Facebook Live event, and just before we actually get to the questions that anyone is welcome to provide to us, I just want to put this question to the table. How can we work towards eliminating gender-based violence and femicide?
Well, I'll go first and say we have to start with education. People, like I said earlier, not aware of their obligations towards children. South Africans have been very desensitized because of our violent history and our violent present. So people prefer not to get involved. And therefore you get passive bystanders, people who see things but do not speak out about it. So you would watch, you would be seeing somebody abusing verbally, emotionally, in some way a child, but not saying, wait, what's happening here is not right. People say it's not my place. But we need to realize, as South Africans particularly, it is our place, because we are all responsible for what is happening. If you don't speak out, you agree with what's happening. You know, the Latin saying is, quita quet consentire videtur. He who is silent is taken to agree. And that has been the problem, which reinforces the issues against children.
And I think to just tie in with what Prof is saying is that even the Act on Sexual Offences talks about the fact that every citizen or every person who is in the borders of the country has a responsibility to report. So it's not only just the people who are, the ones that you listed earlier on, the nurses, the teachers, etc. Every citizen, if you have a reasonable belief that there is a sexual offense or sexual abuse of a child, you are required to report, because it is a responsibility of every citizen. And this attitude that we keep having of just saying, again, it's not happening in my household, or it has nothing to do with me, is what is perpetuating the violence that we're saying, basically what Prof has spoken about. And so in as much as we are talking about raising awareness, we always need to amp up the fact that you have a responsibility. It's always nice when people are saying, I have rights, but then what are those responsibilities that come with those particular rights, And I think that's where we need to hit it more, on your responsibilities that go with every right, and knowing that every child needs to be protected always.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned a lot of systems today. So we spoke about the Department of Social Development, we've spoken about SAPs, we've spoken about teachers, and if you tie that in with education, there needs to be a holistic kind of reform and a holistic kind of thinking when it comes to gender-based violence. We need to address it from all angles. You can't just look at justice reform or police reform or education. They all need to be working in a congruent system. They all need to be happening at the same time. And I think education is the most important part of that, because in order for change to happen, you need to change the narrative and change how people think. We've been talking so much about normalizing and desensitization. The only way we can combat that is by refocusing our attention and thinking about it differently. Thinking that it's not just something that happens to other people, it's something that can happen to me. It's something that is happening to me, like statistics show, like Corné said, what the prof said. It's so prevalent, you can't distance yourself from it. And I think a lot of times we do. We take that responsibility, we put it on other people, but we still we want to reap the benefits of what those others' responsibility onto ourselves. So yeah.
And even what you've mentioned, just having a holistic approach to it, it's even from when the crime occurs, but also when the child has to now go through the criminal justice system. We also have a country where people don't report because of the stigma that they fear, because of the lack of support and the resources. And it goes back to having not just very particular people, but having a variety of professionals in different spaces, making sure that we are creating those safe spaces for the people we want to actually assist. So from now, I'll actually be taking questions. Okay. Not questions yet. I think also with regard to what happens in schools, teachers are listed in that for a reason, because that is one of the places where children spend the most time. So what happens if a child suffers abuse or sexual abuse at the hands of a teacher or at the hands of another pupil? Because we also have a prevalence of children committing crimes.
Now you are touching on a very sensitive topic, one that's often downplayed, because unfortunately there's a lot more concern with reputation than with the well-being of children. There was a study published in South Africa, and that was several years ago. I think it was about 2014. And in that study, it was indicated, it was actually focused on male rape, boys being raped. And the number mentioned that time was around 500,000. So that's a big number of children. And the perpetrators were also found to be teachers and peers. That happened in school. So that now we're just talking about male rape and the underreporting of that. The sexual abuse does often occur in schools. Studies have found, for example, that some males, perpetrators, pedophiles, became teachers for the purpose of having access to children. And that's now, we're not just talking South Africa. You know that it's been global that we've seen those cases of what children experience in schools. And when you say schools, remember we also have universities. That's tertiary education. But then they're 18 years old, they now past school, and we say, okay, well now they're not children. But it still continues. So in other words, what happens in schools and children's experiences victimizes them or may victimize them for further exploitation in later years, even into early adulthood. So there's definitely a need to make sure of what's happening in schools, and that we look at the index of perpetrators, that we make sure that there's checks being done on people who are employed at schools.
And touching on the idea of reputation, I think as a society and as culture, right, we don't talk about how culture informs so much of what we do. South Africa and a lot of cultures have this idea of respect, right, respecting your elders, respecting the power dynamic. And when you'll see sexual abuse and abuse in general happens when you have that dynamic. And so you have employee, boss, or teacher and student, parent and child. That's what makes it so difficult to speak out about it, because you have this idea that that person is older than me, that person is in a higher position than me. And I do know that a lot of times schools will they are a corporation in a much sense, and when it comes to protecting their reputation, that is a bigger picture for them. I mean, there were so many cases in, like, if you look at the church and religion, about just priests being shuffled from one parish to another, rather than actually holding the individual accountable. And that's such a big problem, the stigmatization about protecting my integrity, this image that we've created, it's become such a problem, and it just feeds into the cycle of abuse. I think we sometimes address the symptoms, we don't actually address the main core, the main issue that's taking place.
And I think what you're mentioning now is actually, it's so tricky, because you would think that an institution would come in and say, we want to take a stand against this particular abuse by protecting the learners that are in our school. But what we are finding often is exactly that the school itself would be the one not even writing in their own records books that this thing has happened, and then the school not reporting the matter. So in this way, you're also then creating this dynamic to the learner that I have reached out and said, this is what has been happening to me. And the people that I'm expecting will be there to assist are the ones just saying, okay, we've heard you, and then they just carry on and shuffle the teachers around. So I think we just need to start having that different look, even at reputation. Have a reputation for having a zero tolerance in your school for learners being abused, in that the school takes the active step to make sure everyone within their premises is safe.
And what you brought up was really interesting. We have this idea of dealing with it internally, right? But the thing is, when you have kids, it is an internal issue. You can't just be like, oh, as a school, we've addressed it and the pregnant child has been dismissed or has moved to another school. You can't say that. If you have an instance that happens in your school, the first thing you're supposed to do is you call the police. Every school is supposed to have, or a district is supposed to have, a social worker allocated to that school. But that, we're not seeing that. I mean, I've spoken to teachers who say that we don't have a social worker, we're supposed to have a social worker. I never knew that. Or it's just not happens. I mean, I remember when I went to school, I didn't know we had a social worker. No one ever spoke to me about it. So, like, there are certain things, like Kone was saying, we have great policy. We have amazing legislation that is looking out. We have a comprehensive constitution, but nothing is being enforced, and we're not following through on anything.
And I think you've touched on a really good thing with schools, because whether the abuse, whether it's physical or sexual, is happening within the school or outside the community, usually the school is where a child will exhibit kind of the behavior. Can you tell us more about that behavior?
Yes, you see, the children who experience abuse are likely to either perpetrate abuse or be abused again. It can be either reaction. And that is why I believe the education needs to happen in primary school. And we're not saying necessarily define body parts and that kind of education. That's also important, because, you know, the average child rape victim is around 5. What is important is to say, but this is good behavior and that is bad behavior. This is the way to speak to people, this is the way not to speak to people. This is normal behavior, this is abnormal. That we can start educating children to know what is right and what is wrong. Remember, I don't know about you, but when I was in school, I worshipped my primary school teacher. You would do anything to please that teacher. You would want to be the teacher to like you. So that person actually holds a lot of authority in your life at a young age. So that information coming from that teacher could be most valuable in educating our children in terms of what is okay and what's not okay, so that they can also then again share. I mean, there was a study done by my colleague in Sweden, Prof. Dalal, where they worked in communities, and you know what they actually did? You know the little nursery rhymes that we teach our children, and do, re, mi, and little things that our kids sing? They changed little messages in that native language, saying things like, don't hit my mommy, because if she can't cook me any food, I won't be able to go to school and learn, and I won't have a job one day. So they made little rhymes like that. And that actually changed behavior, because it started making perpetrators aware of the impact it's having on their little children. So there's really a lot we can do from primary school education level.
And I think this question that I've just received, Prof, could go to you. So what should I do if I have a reasonable cause to believe that a child that I know and in my official capacity is either being neglected or being abused? What can I do in that case? But also, how am I protected when I do report it?
I understand. That's why most people ask the issue of protected. I think contacting a social worker first and raising the issue that it can be investigated, then it's reported. And then if that social worker establishes that there is something to be concerned about, then report it to the police, that it can be further investigated. But no reporting means that nothing is going to happen. So I also think that as South Africans, we must become more concerned about the consequences of a very unhappy society. If you just look at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, people who are being medicated for depression and anxiety, that is why. It's because nobody wants to face any possible consequences. But the larger consequences is that we have some of the highest crime rates, some of the highest gender-based violence rate, and that is the consequence of not reporting. So that is much bigger than somebody being angry because you reported.
I think also something that becomes an issue is that what if the abuser is a breadwinner? So people have to kind of wrestle with that, and in such cases, what should be done?
You want me to answer that? In most cases, victims stay in an abusive relationship because of financial dependence, which again, now we're touching on the issue of gender equality and the high level of gender inequality in our country, that women find themselves impossible to escape an abusive situation because they have nowhere to go. And family also don't want to take in people, and because then they're going to be exposed to the stigma and what are the people going to say. So that is a big problem that we are facing with breadwinners, that they abuse that power because they know the victims have nowhere to go.
And that ties in, I think, also with the lack of shelters in South Africa. I mean, we lost so many shelters during COVID because of all the restrictions, but also funding opportunities and stuff. We don't have any shelters really for women if you look at like the Joburg South, right? There's nothing there. So when you have clients, you can't be like, oh, there's a shelter in KZN, but oh, you stay in Pretoria. Like, how are you getting there? Like, there's no resources. We aren't actually helping women to leave. So they stay, and they stay not only for financial, there might be kids involved, and also they don't know better sometimes, in the sense that they don't know where to go or what life is supposed to look like. So it's very difficult to leave. I think sometimes saying just leave him is a lot easier said than done, especially from an outsider's perspective. Because I think when that's not your life, when you're not in the trenches, it's very difficult for you to rationalize it. You're like, but why are you staying with him? But that's that person's entire life. It's their entire ego, their self-esteem. Everything is tied to that person and how they're treated. It takes so long for leaving to actually stick.
Yeah, and there's another issue. You know, if you're thinking about the legal implications, right? A perpetrator who's the breadwinner, he's got the money, can afford the lawyer. And if you don't have support, you can't legally fight your case, you are not going to get anywhere, because what are the chances that then you're going to lose everything? Everything you've worked for, everything you've sacrificed, all the abuse you've already tolerated, walking away means losing everything, literally. Walking out of somewhere with the clothes on your back. Because you can say, oh, well, there's an anti-nuptial agreement. So if you leave with your clothes. So what are the options for women who find themselves there?
And kids, you'll see kids are used so often as just tools. And it links back to what we're talking about, children and how do we protect children. Children are often used in divorce settlements by the wealthier spouse, and they'll use that as a threat. Yes. Fine, you can leave me, but you're never seeing this child ever again. And like you said, he has the money, they have the means, they will have lawyers. They might not care about the kid, but they will hurt you. And that's what they've always been doing, and that's what they'll continue to do.
And I mean, the mere fact that the person is the breadwinner means they're the ones who have the money to support the children. So if you're depending on that person, and they're telling you that if you leave, even a court will not give you the children if you have no way of sustaining the children. So it then becomes a system where the mother is trapped either way. You either are staying in this situation where your children, remember, are also seeing this. Because they're seeing this, they're normalizing it in a way that they're still at a very young age where they don't understand what is happening. And as Prof was saying, that once it starts earlier on, as you carry on growing into your high school, your tertiary education, these things follow you. And in order to break that trend, the responsibility is always left too often to the mothers. who at that particular time are themselves needing to be protected. So we still have a way to go.
We do. But you touched on divorces and how children can be used in such matters. And one of the good things about our Children's Act is that it empowers children to have their own legal representation.
Yes.
So whether a child can actually give their own instruction to a lawyer, then they can have a legal representation. Or if the child is quite young, you can have a curator, and that curator acts in the best interest of that child. So they'll investigate everything, investigate the different parents, the different people around the child, to make sure that they make a recommendation to the court.
Yeah.
But we also have the Family Advocate's Office. But you spoke also on education. How do you think we can use the curriculum to empower children?
I think the best place to start would be life orientation, right? I mean, that's what these classes are supposed to be about. And I think what's really important is addressing real life. I think sometimes we think of things in a very academic sense or a very like high level kind of way. And when it comes to kids, you have to explain in a way that they understand. It might sound like you're dumbing it down for them, but you're just bringing it to their level. Like all that vocabulary that we're using, like the cycle of abuse and all this stuff, it can be explained to a child. You can show them patterns, they understand patterns. And you just have to chat with them and bring it down to their level and be more approachable about it. I think sometimes also we take this approach where we scare children, like we say, don't go outside, crime, this. And it's true, there is crime, you should be cautious. But you should also say it and phrase it and like encourage them and be like, protect them.
Yes, I know Matlabana has a little booklet called Survival Guide for Kids. And it's translated in Afrikaans, English, isiZulu and Sesotho. That they distribute to approximately 30,000 school children a year. And those kind of things are also very handy because it's in a child-friendly way, explaining their rights and also what they can do to deal with any kind of abuse.
Also, I think, just to tie into what you said now on there being this education of kids, or of learners, there was a wave that happened when there was a term called stranger danger, where we created the impression that the danger is always outside.
Yes.
And during that time, there were actually an increased number of people in the households, because the majority of the perpetrators are people we know. So it is an uncle, it is whoever it is. But if we carry on saying things to children to scare them, to be like, there's stranger danger, they don't start to look internally to be like, no, even the person who's transporting me from home to school is being inappropriate. But because we've drilled into the kid's mind that it's someone from outside, they're uncomfortable or unsure to then come in and say, but also uncle is doing 1, 2, 3, 4. And also just, I wanted to touch on the part of, it's not only in the school, it's on your way to school that we also need to highlight. There's a lot that is happening with the transport system of learners from wherever they're picking them up to by the time they get to the school. And the stories that you hear at that point where the driver is doing 1, 2, 3, 4, but because everyone is relying on that transport, it becomes an issue, and it seems as though we're leveraging the children in some way in order for them to get to school. And we need to start having then those conversations that when we're talking about safety and health in school, we are also including your transportation to the school. Yeah.
And also, I don't think we give kids enough credit. They are smart. Like, kids are smarter than we give them credit for. You can explain stuff to them. You can enlighten them. You can have conversations with them. Yes, each kid is individual, but we're smarter than we give them credit for, especially when it comes to emotional capacity. I think children are very intuitive, and they're good at reading a room. I mean, the kids, the body language is one of their main things. Like, sometimes they can't verbalize it, but they can feel it. They're very empathetic that way. So I think sometimes people say this is a grown-up discussion, but no, you can talk to children about it. You have to talk to children about it.
There was even a movement at one point where they were teaching, it's like in a family you'd have a code word, right? So if a child is uncomfortable with that particular person, they'd say a code word to their mom, and their mom knows to immediately like extract them from the situation. Because as she mentioned, the whole thing of respect, you know, you go in and if the child doesn't want to hug you, and then it's looked as if the child is being disrespectful, but they are exercising that thing of saying, my body, my privacy, etc. So we need to encourage those things in children instead of shunning them, that they don't want to sit with.
We proved that something wrong. There was reason to make an inquiry. Now you're touching on something else that we must also be aware of in our society, is that there are people who will do vindictive reporting as well. So someone can innocently say something doesn't look right here and report it, okay, and it gets investigated. And it can turn out, okay, that wasn't quite correct. Or because there are people who maliciously report to damage somebody, they don't want that person to lose their job or to be discredited in the organization. We can't say all men are bad and all women are good. Unfortunately, we know that doesn't work like that. There are some women who will also exhibit behavior that is reprehensible to get back at somebody, a vindictiveness. So we can't rule that out either. So it's the process followed, I think, that's important.
And even with how the act is drafted, it says if you suspect.
Yeah. Yes.
So if you suspect, so that an investigation can happen. So even if you report it to the Department of Social Development or a social worker from a NGO, they investigate. And then they come to a conclusion that's going to go to the Children's Court. Even with the police, they have to investigate. If it's a potential crime, they have to investigate. And then they come to the point of, yes, a crime has actually been committed or not. And that's the thing. I think it's the intention behind it, going back, that there are people who are vindictive, but you have to report. So it's the intention behind it. You are actually still kind of protected by the law, that if it happens that it's not, it might be something else. It might be that it's not even in the family. It's a neighbor. The child has been abused, but now it's only come out through the investigation. And that's why it's so important to actually report. And that's, I think, the main fear that people have.
Also, you do remain anonymous. So social workers aren't by law anything allowed to give your name out. So they can't be like, oh, Sally down the street suspects that you're hitting your kids. No, they can't give your name out. So I think there's a lot of fear about reporting. But I think rather be safe than sorry. You were concerned about something, nothing happened. Good. That's a good thing. That's not something to be like upset about. Like, sure, you might have put a family through something, but you were worried about a child, and now it's okay. I mean, it could have been the totally opposite, and you were right, and then how would you feel? Like,
yeah, exactly. Now the child is left in this dire situation, and no one's actually done anything about it. And again, gender-based violence, it can even be children who commit it. And oftentimes people don't report because it's a child, or sometimes you might go to authorities and say, no, it's a child. So in those particular cases, it's just a good reminder to remind people that we have a criminal justice system. Even for children, we have a child justice system for a reason. And it also investigates and makes sure that everyone is safe, adults, women, children, all of the vulnerable in our society. But I'd love to thank everyone for tuning in, as well as our panel, our great panel, for having this discussion with us. Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
yes.